folks are going to be sort of heading back on in, we're going to go ahead and get started. I do have a question. What was the name of the book that was mentioned in the first couple slides? Yes, it will also be at the end of these slides in the there's sources and further reading there, but I'll go ahead and put it in the chat section. It is called The Body Keeps the Score. And that is, it's a little bit older now. I think it came out in 2015, but it is what I believe to be currently the best sort of overview of what the current science and thinking is about what trauma is. And I also like the fact that at the last third or so of the book, van der Kolk talks about kind of the state of the art of treatment and what we're doing. And our training today will not go that far. That would be a training for another time. But as I said, I've used it as a beginning textbook for students. So if this is something you're interested in, I would absolutely check that out. It doesn't mention disabilities so much. So if you want a bigger overview of what we've been doing here today, not to make this a commercial pitch or anything, but again, Kevin would like me to mention that you can buy our book through the NADD website or Amazon. So please feel free to do that. But van der Kolk is probably the most widely known and accessible expert right now. Okay, let's see. How can we address or identify triggers in nonverbal clients and autistic clients? I'm so glad you asked that. We're jumping ahead a teeny bit, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about that anyway. You probably can't identify triggers most of the time. A lot of people who are dealing with trauma, and again, regardless of if they're neurotypical or neurodiverse or their IQ or anything like that, we don't always know why people get triggered. Sometimes we do, often we don't. So that can be a real source of frustration when I do trauma therapy, which is a big focus of my private practice is trauma and grief and loss. Sometimes you just don't know. So there are times when it might be obvious to you. If I walk into a room and an individual takes a swing at me, and then later I come in and I'm not wearing my glasses and they seem fine, okay, maybe people wearing glasses is hard for them for who knows why, right? And I do think you can sort of put that picture together a little bit as you go on knowing people and building that relationship. But there are two really important pieces here. Number one, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the brain gets good at whatever we ask it to do a lot of. This is in some ways the key to understanding trauma, especially chronic trauma, trauma that happened early in childhood, trauma that's been repeated over years. What I mean by that is that when we do something repeatedly, our brain devotes more and more space and energy to that activity. So when you first started to learn how to drive, you had to really focus and you were like this, and staring at the road, and your friend would turn on the radio and you'd be like, stop it. And now those of you who drive, you can drink your coffee and put on mascara and, tell a kid to quit it in the back seat. You don't have to devote as much conscious energy to it because your brain has created pathways, shortcuts, kind of like on a desktop, right? And the more you do something, the quicker and more powerful your brain is at doing that thing. So you don't have to try so hard to do it. Another example would be learning a musical instrument. When you first start, you have to practice. If you've been playing for a long time and you've spent many, many, many hours practicing, you can do it and be thinking about, the tone you want or something, and you're not thinking about where to put your hands on the keys. Your brain has gotten better and better and better and faster and stronger at doing that. That's great news if you want to learn how to play the piano or drive a car. It's not so great when it comes to trauma. Every time that alarm system gets set off, and we will talk about what I'm talking about in the brain, when that alarm system gets triggered, so again, think of my professor jumping out of his seat, right? Then when that's triggered, the brain and body go through that kind of like a fire drill, like a fire alarm, right? Every time it's set off, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger, and parts of the brain get more and more sensitized to it. So for some people, it takes less and less and less, to the point where it almost seems to set itself off. Let me give you another example. Imagine a smoke detector in your kitchen. and it's a little bit more sensitive than you would like. So if you burn toast and the kitchen fills with smoke, it goes off. And you're like, yeah, okay, I get it. There's a lot of smoke, and you turn it off and you get the smoke out. But imagine that it gets sensitive every time it happens, more and more and more. So the next time you're just making spaghetti, nothing's burning, and it goes off. And then you are, I don't know, warming up some leftovers in the microwave, and the alarm goes off. And then you're just running hot water, and the alarm goes off. And now you're at the point where it's the middle of the night, no one's even in the kitchen, and the alarm goes off. So for some people, they can identify some triggers, and sometimes they get triggered and they don't know why. They never know why. So when I work with clients, I spend a lot of time with this, that if we can identify some common sense things, like my professor never went to another movie about the Vietnam War in a movie theater. Good plan, right? But there are a bunch of other things that you can't identify. And in fact, and we'll get to this in a couple of slides, when trauma has been early in someone's life, it's like building a house and it's already wired into the house, then trauma can affect everything about who they are. So the other problem with, we don't know all the triggers is it's much bigger than triggers. Okay. And again, I don't want to go too far into this because we'll talk more about it. But if trauma has created a person who is often shut down or often activated, screaming, kneeling, and flailing like my professor was, who thinks that they are worthless and the world is dangerous, and they've got to, hit someone before they hit them, and all of that stuff, we're way beyond triggers. Trauma touches everything about who that person is. So if we know a trigger, if there's a common sense thing we can do, no petite ladies with long dark hair because the client's going to try to punch them. Okay, great. But triggers can be sort of a dead end. So all of this is to say, do what you learn that can be common sense and helpful for an individual, but don't worry about knowing what all of them are. And I'll add one last thing to it. Even though we don't have enough time, I can't help myself. If we were going to do a training about trauma treatment and the healing of trauma in more detail, then what I would tell you is you need the brain to get triggered. Not hopefully, completely spazzing someone out, but when someone is triggered, they're scared, they're angry, they're shut down, and then they get to experience something different. Instead of punching them, the person with them comforts them. They try something scary and they succeed at it. That's what allows the brain to have a different experience. And now the wiring starts going in a different direction. And that's how brains actually change. So the bad news about trauma is that the brain gets really good at whatever we ask it to do a lot of, including fear. But the good news after the bad news is brains can also change back. And in order to do that, it has to actually experience it and then have something different happen over and 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 over. But that's how trauma treatment actually works. So if I could magically take your individual, verbal, nonverbal, doesn't matter, and somehow, build this little perfect cocoon around them so they were never triggered again, it would prevent them from healing. So we don't want people to be needlessly triggered, right? If we can find a way to not freak them out, that's good. But we don't need to worry about, we've got to know what all the triggers are. And ultimately, that's not really the point that we're going to be focused on. So that may have been a much longer answer than you wanted, but hopefully that was helpful. And I will knit together some of those pieces as we go forward. Okay, so great question. Love it when you guys do that. Please make sure to keep letting me know what you're thinking about. Okay, so I think, do I need to do this again? No, here I am. Okay, so we're going to get back to the slides moving so quickly. I could do this all day with you guys, but we're going to move a little faster than that. So yes, this is exactly what I was saying. When you think about what trauma affects, we tend to think of that one-to-one relationship. I was a soldier in Iraq and there were a lot of explosions. So I don't go to the fireworks in the summer because I get triggered. Simple, fair enough, right? But depending on how early trauma happened, how severe it was, and how ongoing it was, how chronic it was, trauma can affect everything about somebody, not just their ability to sit through fireworks. So a better example might be, imagine a ship on the ocean and there's a leak in the ship. At first, the water just gets in, right where the leak is. But, if you don't know about the leak and it goes on and on and on, that water gets everywhere into the ship. And given enough time and enough water, it'll sink that ship, maybe even starting from something relatively small. So think about all the different ways that trauma can affect a human being. Trauma can affect how aware we are of our thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and where your body is. Again, this is a much bigger conversation, but essentially, if I am trying not to feel terror and horror, one of the ways I do that is by shutting off my feelings. I check out or I dissociate. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And that's a reflex action. It's not a decision that I made. And all animal life can do a version of that. Okay. So if I'm doing that, then I don't feel the fear or the horror or the powerlessness or whatever. But it also means I don't feel much of anything else either. And in fact, some people will talk about dissociating, taking two things that are usually connected and just separating them. That's all that is. In terms of leaving their body. We hear this from children a lot. So, because they seem to be pretty good at it, where, the bad thing was about to happen. And so I would go into my stuffed animal, or I would be on the ceiling watching, but it wasn't happening to me. That's a survival mechanism. As I said, it is reflexive. It is built into the nervous system. But the problem with that is that you get good at not being in your body. And that means it's hard to know what you're feeling. Emotions are in the body. If you're not connected to your bodily sensations, if you're not connected to difficult or scary emotions, you're not connected to anything. And so people can go through life looking depressive, looking shut down, isolated, not connecting to people, because they're frequently in that state. And remember, the brain gets good at whatever we ask it to do a lot of. So the more someone does it, the more time they spend doing it. Trauma can affect how you react, think, and judge the intentions and actions of others. Yeah, if you have experienced deeply in your bones that people are dangerous or out to get you, you will react accordingly. And we'll talk about this more in a minute, the alarm system of the brain is based on taking in a little tiny bit of information and then reacting to it to keep us safe. So an example of that might be you're walking down the street and you glance down and you see a snake right by your foot. You'd probably jump. And then you take another look and you go, oh, that snake appears to have leaves coming out of its head. That's unusual. And the snake isn't moving, even though I jumped and screamed. I think what I'm actually looking at here is a stick that looks like a snake. There are parts of your brain, largely in the sensory cortex is connected to the amygdala, which is in the middle of your brain. Again, we'll do that in a sec. And it took in a teeny little piece of information, long and skinny and brown, let's say, and went, snake. And that is a good evolutionary strategy, right? If my brain assumes that every stick is a snake, I'd rather do that than be wrong and miss one snake, right? So we get a little bit of information, our alarm system reacts, maybe a little, maybe a lot. And then the thinking brain comes back into the conversation and goes, wait a second, here's some more information that we didn't get right away. There are leaves and it's not moving, blah, blah, blah. I think it's actually a stick. We can calm down. All right. Now imagine that your brain is way dialed up to see everything as a threat. I worked with teenagers who, they would be walking down the hall at school, someone would bump into them, and they had turned around to punch that person in the mouth long before they had checked to see, did they do it on purpose? Did they even see me? Is this really someone messing with me? What are my options? What's going to happen if I do? That train had long left the station. And many of you work with people who react rather than respond. Right? And trauma just kicks it up a notch. It makes it even faster and more exaggerated. There are people that you work with, I guarantee, that you already know. You can't walk up behind them and put your hand on their shoulder before they've seen you. They're going to turn around swinging or whatever it is. So imagine how different, let's just take one of those teenagers that I worked with. How different would their lives have been if they'd had that extra half second to pause and more accurately assess, this is not actually a snake, this is a stick. I often thought that if they could have had 3 more seconds, many of them would not be in prison, would not be in a gang, would not be wherever they are. Right? So when I say it can affect everything about your life, this is an example. Quickly and accurately responding to your environment, we've talked about that. How much you can ever relax in your own skin. I'm going to spend a little time on this, and then we're going to kind of go through the rest because I want to get to all the material today. So you can imagine what it's like if you feel like you constantly have to be on guard for snakes, and they're everywhere and they can pop out at any moment. If I've talking to anyone who has a snake phobia, I apologize. I'll throw in some free sessions and we'll fix it. Don't worry. You can imagine what it would be like to be on guard like that all the time. And in fact, when we go through sort of the groups of symptoms of PTSD, the first one is hypervigilance. And it's just like what it sounds like. You're always on guard. Well, what would it do to you to be constantly filled with cortisol and at times adrenaline, the stress hormones? It would make it really hard to fall asleep. It would make it really hard to stay asleep. You might have chronic headaches, muscle pain, right? Digestive issues, lowered immunity. There are many folks you work with who have all of those things. And obviously, I'm not saying that all of them are 100% caused by trauma, but I will say, you can imagine that trauma at least makes it worse. And if I have any nurses or folks with medical training in the room, you guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Those mystery headaches that nobody can seem to solve, the tummy troubles that never seem to get better, the sleep problems. Oh my God, the sleep problems. Many of you work with people who have a lot of trouble falling asleep and a lot of trouble staying asleep. And for some of them, it becomes a source of power struggles. When I worked in residential treatment, there were always kids who wanted to stay up all night. I mean, teenagers are kind of vampires anyway, but they did not want to go to bed, and they wanted to sleep on the couch in the staff room rather than in their bedroom. Well, why might that be? Number one, and I wish I'd known then what I know now, probably bedrooms were places where bad things happened, right? But the other thing, even more simple than that, is that if you feel like you have to be on guard, you can't deeply relax enough to fall asleep. And you startle easily, and you have nightmares, which is intrusion, not hypervigilance. But anyway, we start to see it ripple out and ripple out and ripple out, that there are all these things that are not only causing our individuals trouble, but sometimes actually bring them into conflict with staff or family or other people, you know? So the ability to simply feel safe and calm in your own body can be taken away from you by trauma, and it can have far-reaching medical and social implications from that. The rest of the stuff you kind of get where we're going, but we do have to talk about empathy. I'm going to talk about that just for 1 second. There are people that you work with or have worked with who have been assessed and diagnosed as having little empathy or no empathy. And they've been diagnosed with conduct disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial, blah, 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 blah. And not getting into the challenges and benefits of diagnosis, just know that it's a very inexact practice. I will say this. In order for me to be empathetic to you, all right, if I'm sitting with one of you guys and I'm feeling your feelings, the simplest definition of empathy, I feel what you feel. In order for that to happen, and I won't bore you with the brain science, but to sum it up, I kind of bounce it off myself to know what that feeling is, and then I can identify it in you. It's fractions of a second. You are not consciously aware that it's happening. But what happens is, if you see my face on the screen right now, and my eyes well up and I've got tears coming down my face, my mouth is down, and I'm crying, what would happen in a fraction of a second is you would bounce it off of your experience and go, when I'm crying and my face is doing that and I'm crying, sad, making those sounds, I'm sad. I think Laura is sad, right? Okay. So now imagine that, I'll switch it back to me because that's, I think, a little more comfortable. So I'm trying to figure out how you're feeling. You're crying. Is she sad? What's going on? For me to do that, I have to be able to feel. There has to be something to bounce off of. If I am checked out, if I'm dissociated, if I'm disconnected from my body, if I don't feel my feelings, if I'm numb or not present, I can't feel your feelings either. So when we look at people, especially young people, and again, this is where bias starts to creep back in. So especially male clients of color, if they have experienced things that, number one, they may have learned on a strategic level, be aggressive before other people can be aggressive to you, right? That's just smart for where some of them have lived. But on a deeper level, if they are numb from trauma, then there's nothing to bounce off of, and they look pretty emotionless or lacking in empathy. And we know that when some people, some, not all, when some people who've gotten those sociopathic diagnoses have been treated for their trauma, oh, suddenly they can be empathetic to other people's experiences. Woo. So again, I'm not saying that a sociopathic kind of diagnosis or lack of empathy diagnosis is always wrong. But I am saying that in a population where we know there are high rates of trauma, and that they may not have been identified for reasons that we'll talk more about, but again, also bringing that bias in, depending on who we're talking about, then what we may actually be looking at is someone who is shut down. So now, when we talk about the consequences of trauma and going beyond triggers, we can see that this can affect everything. You can be given a completely wrong diagnosis. You can be treated as a criminal rather than somebody who's been injured. And I'm not saying that people aren't responsible for their criminal acts. I'm just saying we can start to see the profound impact that unidentified or unsupported trauma can have in someone's life. Okay, so anything that causes a connection in your environment can be potentially traumatizing. So when we're talking, especially for young children, what can be trauma is not simply mistreatment or harm. Anything that disrupts their ability to connect to a parent can be potentially traumatizing. So now think about homes where there's no violence or mistreatment, but there's a poor fit with a caregiver because the caregiver is struggling with their own depression or mental illness or addiction, or there's a struggle for fit because of the parents' difficulty dealing with having a baby that was born with a disability or neurodiverse or whatever it is. We can start to see how the groundwork can be laid very early on for deeply threatening, stressful brain states in the folks we work with. It doesn't just have to be one of those big T traumas of mistreatment. All righty. I love this slide. I don't have time to go through it. Basically, just know anything can be potentially traumatizing given the right set of circumstances. But there are only so many ways we can respond to it in our brains and bodies. So we're not going to talk about that. I'm going to move very quickly through this because we're not really focusing on diagnosing trauma, but just so that you know, if you are working with someone who has been given that PTSD diagnosis, among other things, here's what someone looked at to arrive at that diagnosis. So there are 4 clusters of symptoms, okay? And the first one we've largely talked about, hypervigilance. It results in easy startling, irritability. I would be very irritable if I had to be on guard all the time. You may see this played out behaviorally if somebody kind of spazzes out, to use the clinical language. If their way is blocked or they can't see the door, or someone turns off the nightlight or whatever, it may be due to hypervigilance. Avoidance used to be called constriction in earlier versions of this. And this simply means you make yourself smaller and smaller to avoid triggers and to avoid being noticed by others. Makes sense, right? So avoidance might be, we're not going to worry about like recovered memories and stuff. Memory is a very controversial area. And I will say that most of the time, I don't think people experience that. I'm going to pause here for 1 second because I'm getting a phone call. And I just want to make sure this is all going okay. And then we're going to go into intrusion. Did you call me? Okay, I don't know what that is, so I'm going to let that go. That was Kevin, so I just want to make sure everything is working okay, but I trust that if there were a problem with this, somebody would tell me. Let me make sure. Oh, there we go. No, I think we're good. Okay, so going back to the slides. Let me go back to the slideshow and we'll play it from the present slide. There we go. So when we think about PTSD, this is often what people are thinking about, right? So what happened to my professor in the movie theater was a flashback. He was re-experiencing the trauma. He wasn't thinking about it or remembering it. It set off that alarm system, and in his sensory systems in his body jumped and screamed to keep him safe, just as it did during the war. Flashbacks, nightmares. Interestingly, we don't have a medication to treat trauma directly, but we do have a medication to help with nightmares. Hang on while I get this call. Yes. Yes. Okay. Let me work on that. Okay, so apparently you guys can't see the slides right now, which I think is probably not as big of a deal as me talking about it, but I will try again to share the screen. And let's see, there they are. Okay, so hopefully you guys can see this. So dealing with nightmares, dealing with flashbacks, the one medication that we have to treat nightmares, prazosin, can be helpful for some people. But this is typically what we think of when we think of trauma. The next thing would be negative alterations in cognition or mood. This just means how you see yourself, how you see the world, how you expect things to go for you, and feeling anxious and depressed a lot of the time can be an effect of trauma, which makes sense. So to get to the question that we had a little bit earlier, some of these things are a little bit easier if someone has an ability to tell you of what they're experiencing. But when they don't, we have to look for different signals of distress. And it's always important to remember, using a biopsychosocial model, that there can also be medical conditions that can create some of these signs of agitation or pain as well. So it's always really, really important, especially with people with limited communication, to make sure that they're getting really good skilled medical care, so that if they're banging their head, they might be doing that because they're triggered or scared, or they might be doing it because they have an untreated tooth infection, right? So it takes much longer, of course, and it takes a lot of close attention in patients to discern when someone who has less communication, maybe it's experiencing some of these levels of distress. Okay, so very quickly, we are going to talk about the brain. I've mentioned up to this point that when we have something happen around us, or perhaps there's a sensation inside of our body that triggers a traumatic experience, our body reacts as if that experience is happening, even if it was many miles and many years away. So in order to understand that more, I'm going to give you a very simple way of talking about the brain that isn't exactly how things work in terms of how we think about the brain now with the most current research and thinking, but it's close enough that it'll help us understand what we're dealing with, okay? So in order to do this, what I need you guys to do is take your hand, it doesn't matter which one, put your thumb in the middle of your hand and then wrap your fingers lightly around it to make a loose fist. Obviously, don't do this to the point that it's tight and it hurts. And this is a decent model of what we're going to be talking about in terms of functions of the brain. So if you think of your forearm as your body and your wrist as your neck, and then the heel of your palm is the bottom of your brain. So we sometimes call that the brainstem. Another word is diencephalon. Don't worry about that. A lot of the functions of the brainstem are involved with the automatic function of your body. So breathing, digesting food, maintaining temperature, helping with balance and standing upright and moving around, that kind of stuff. This is largely controlled in this region of the brain, the brainstem. If this is damaged, like someone, I don't know, someone gets their head cut off or something, this is what causes immediate death because it no longer tells the heart to keep beating, right? So this is sort of the automatic running of the body. Then if you lift your fingers up a little bit and you see where your thumb is in the middle of your fist, that is sort of a reasonable version of your limbic system. Now, the limbic system develops after the brainstem. The brainstem is mostly fully functional when an infant is born, which makes sense. A newborn, you know, they're still kind of tinkering a little, but they have a heart rate and they can breathe and digest food and stuff, which makes sense. You need all of that stuff working. The limbic system doesn't fully stop wiring itself until around age 2 or so. And the limbic system is involved with a lot of things. It's involved with memory and learning. It is where we think of emotions being identified and to some extent regulated. It is where we take in information from our senses and decide if we're safe or not, right? We don't decide it, but there's a structure in the limbic system called the amygdala. And if you, in our little hand brain, if you imagine 2 little almond-shaped freckles at the bottom corners of your thumb, then that's the amygdala. It's sort of on either side of the brain. And what happens is the sensations come in, either, you know, something in my body, my stomach is upset, my heart is racing, or sense information from outside the body. I look down and I see a snake, right? My eyes take in that information. It all goes through the amygdala, right? And the amygdala very quickly sorts things into known, unknown, safe, unsafe, pleasant, unpleasant. I like it, I don't like it, in fractions of a second, so quickly. You are not consciously aware of this happening. A good example of that might be if you've ever had a really good case of food poisoning and you were just awfully sick and felt terrible. Whatever food you ate before that happened, whether that's actually what made you sick or not, probably the sight of that food, the smell of that food, even someone mentioning that food. Some of you right now are just going like, bleh, right? For my sister, it was cotton candy. So I tried to say the words cotton candy as much as I could when we were kids. What has happened is that you now have a sense memory. Your amygdala has recorded being horribly ill and associated it with that food, let's say. And so now any kind of exposure to that can cause that reaction, right? That's the amygdala. That's where that information gets sort of paired up, okay? And then if you look at your hand and your fingers coming down to your fingernails, this roughly is what we refer to as your cortex. And the cortex is the last part of your brain to develop. It's obviously somewhat developed when you're born, but it keeps developing and changing and growing and wiring. And that doesn't stop until age 25 or even 30, which some of you may have heard. So the cortex is involved with what we think of as executive function. So what we think of as thinking, reasoning, logic, language, written language, spoken language, evaluating choices, right? Cause and effect. If I do this, this is what might happen. Controlling impulses. I'm really mad at my boss, but I'm not going to punch him in the face. That stuff is largely regulated and worked with by the cortex. Many of the folks we work with have had damage or malformation or something in the cortex, which is why many of the stuff people struggle with in our care involve those executive functions. This is a very sensitive part of the brain. So we typically will see cortex damage or cortex interference. Not so much with the limbic system and not nearly as much with the brainstem. If the brainstem isn't working, you're dead, right? So we're very familiar with what happens when the cortex isn't functioning the way other people's does or is struggling with something. So what happens when an alarm gets set off? Something happens in the amygdala that says danger. Now, it might be something that we would all find dangerous. A tiger bursts into the room where you guys are right now. Everyone's amygdala would say, uh-oh, there's a tiger, I need to get out of here, right? So what happens then is we go into a state of hyperarousal. And hyperarousal just means that our normal level of activation, our heart rate, our breathing, blood flow, all of that stuff goes from kind of baseline normal, which is where most of us hopefully are right now. You're feeling calm and safe. There's no sensory input that your amygdala is saying is dangerous to you. And then we go into hyperarousal. So our heart rate speeds up, our breath may get fast, we may be sweating, we may feel tingly and numb, all of that stuff. What has happened is, and this will be important in a minute, what has happened is that our amygdala has signaled danger, danger, danger. That releases, among other things, norepinephrine and cortisol in the brain. The only reason that we care about that is we're going to come back to that in a minute. So that triggers the release of cortisol and adrenaline in the body. So we're in an adrenalized state. And you guys are familiar with another term for this state, fight or flight. I think all of us have heard that. It just means your body is getting ready to have you fight the tiger or run away from the tiger. Personally, I recommend running. I would not try to fight the tiger, but you've got to walk your own path. So fight or flight. And then there are actually two other responses in this hyperarousal category. Okay. And they are freeze. Now, freeze means just like what it sounds like. You get very still and hope not to be noticed. So a lot of prey animals will go into this. Think about a rabbit on the road and, it's kind of trapped in your headlights and it's like, You can see in the second that you can see it in your headlights, that rabbit is still, but it's at a high state of tension. And as soon as you swerve around it, what happens? Boom, the rabbit takes off. So it's still not, hoping not to be seen or noticed, but it's still very, very activated. And then the fourth one is fawn. So this will be in a later slide, don't worry, but it's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Now, fawning isn't a baby deer here. Fawning means moving closer to the threat to try to neutralize it. And this is, threats from other human beings, which is what most of us would deal with. So smiling, placating, appeasing, flattering, maybe being flirtatious or seductive, any of those things that we do to try to calm the threat down to keep us safe is still a hyperarousal reaction. This is very, 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 very important to know because fawning, sometimes people get blamed for that. Oh, you were okay with what was happening, or it may be something that you notice in yourself that you don't like, that it's something that you go into. I know I smile sometimes when someone's very angry and I'm very activated and frightened. It is involuntary. It is, remember, fractions of a second. So it is written into our nervous system to do something to try to stop the threat, right? Whatever it is that may or may not actually be a danger, but for whatever reason, our brain is treating as a threat. That's hyperarousal. Now there's another state, and that is hypoarousal. So to explain this, let's talk about that same rabbit, okay? Except that instead of being in front of a car, this rabbit has been caught by a coyote. And it's in the coyote's jaws. Is the rabbit rigid? No, it might thrash around a little bit, but once it's, knows that it's really caught, what does the rabbit's body do? It collapses, right? It goes limp. This is, I don't want to be here for this. I'm checking out, right? So the body systems actually slow down. The breathing slows. You can sometimes see the muscle tension collapse. You can see people kind of fall in, or you may see people go into like a fetal state or something like that. This is also a survival mechanism. Okay, it is not chosen. Some people will do both. They'll get hyperaroused and fight, flail, flail, flail. It doesn't work. And eventually they go into collapse. Some people will go into collapse right away. So collapse refers to, again, stillness, but at a low state of energy. It's like the power has been cut off. It also is where we were talking about dissociation. So this is where people's sense of being in their body, feeling your body, can separate. In extreme cases, we can see people who, they're missing time. They wake up in a place, they don't know how they got there. What we used to call multiple personality is what we now call dissociative identity disorder. That's at the very far end of this dissociative process. But all of us dissociate to some extent or another. If you're thinking about your drive home from work and you're like, I went to this amazing training today, and you're thinking about it or replaying an argument you had in your head, and you realize you're pulling into your driveway and you haven't really been paying attention, that's a very mild form of dissociating. Sometimes dissociating just means words and feelings are separated. So if you've ever had the experience of someone, often kind of out of nowhere, telling a trauma story. So you're making spaghetti with your individual and suddenly they're talking about the time that they were assaulted And you're like, whoa. And they tell it with no emotion. I've seen people do this in my clinical work in my office with horrifying levels of trauma, like captivity and torture. I did some pro bono work with the refugee population for a while. And one gentleman that I will never forget came in, and I would never have asked about this. I think I asked, like, how are things going? You know, whatever. And he started telling his story of what had happened to him that caused him to seek asylum in the US. It was so horrifying that I could barely stay in the room to listen to it. I had to grab the armrest of my chair to sit there and be present with him. And he talked as if he were reading off a grocery list. There was no emotion on his face. There's no emotion in his voice. That is dissociation. Why I'm using that example in particular is that if you don't know what you're seeing, it can look like this person doesn't care or it doesn't bother them. What you're actually seeing is the body going into a survival state to try to survive that level of stress. Okay, so what happens is we all are built this way. We can see versions of this in almost any life form. Any animal you can think of has some version of these two states. The point is that, remember what we said, whatever the brain does a lot of, it gets better and better and better at doing. So over time, what will happen is someone's what we call window of tolerance, this kind of band here where the environment feels safe and we're functioning at normal levels, it goes from this to this. So people spend more and more and more time hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused, freaked out or checked out. And the longer this happens, I could even make this even narrower. Over time, you start to get somebody who seems to spend all their time either checked out or freaked out, that it takes less and less and less to set that off or trigger it. And some of you work with people where you know, right? If they've gone off, that's it. That's your morning. Because not only is it quicker to get them into that red zone or blue zone, but it takes longer to bring them back out of it. It takes longer and longer and longer because the brain gets really good at whatever we ask it to do a lot of. Now, why we're talking about this process is that it's in those moments when someone is in the red zone or the blue zone. One of the things that happens in the brain is that these systems, the brainstem, the limbic system, the cortex, kind of stop talking to each other. Some areas are very, very activated. So if we did a brain scan of someone when they're in one of these states, the red zone or the blue zone, what we would see is that their survival mechanisms, right? The limbic system, the brainstem, I got to get out of here, I've got to hide, I've got to shut down, are very, very active. We'd see a lot of activity. In the cortex, it would be relatively shut down. And again, from a survival standpoint for millions of years, that totally makes sense. If you're trying to get away from a tiger, you don't need to be able to do long division. You don't need to be able to make change for the bus. You might not even be able to use language. You might be able to scream, ah, but you can't give someone complex directions, right? Because that part of your brain shut down. You don't need that right now. So your brain is focused on what you need to do to survive. What that means is you can't do a lot of thinking. Okay, so that seems reasonable, right? Why am I going into this in such detail? Because very often when we are dealing with someone who is actually in one of these two states, we're still trying to reason with them and get them to reason with us. Or, as we'll see a little bit later, one of my favorite quotes from Bruce Perry, a childhood trauma expert, people often want to work with other people from the top down, but the brain actually works from the bottom up. If that alarm system is going off, nothing else can happen. Imagine that you guys are in your room right now and the fire alarm goes off. And so there are, wah, 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 there are the alarms and there may be flashing emergency lights. Maybe the main power lights go down. You can hear a fire truck screaming down the road. And now imagine if I asked you to take a quiz. How would you do? Probably very badly, because your brain won't let you do anything else until you're safe. That's how we all survived over millions of years, right? So when we are talking to someone or dealing with someone who is in their red zone or blue zone, and we say things like, There are going to be consequences for that behavior, or tell me what's wrong, use your words. For some people, they won't be able to speak. In those few seconds, my professor could scream, but he couldn't say any words other than incoming. Now, after just a few seconds, when his brain started coming out of that red zone and back into his window of tolerance, and his thinking brain was back online, and he could look around and see that he was in a movie theater and not a war zone, his ability to speak came back to him, but it took a few moments. Now imagine you're dealing with someone whose brain already struggles with that, right? Maybe they already have some damage to the speech center or whatever. It's going to take even longer. So our job, when we talk about responding to trauma, trauma responsive care, not just knowing about it, but responding to it and working with it. The first thing we need to know is that nobody's brain can do anything we want it to do until we get it back into that white zone, into that window of tolerance. We've got to get them out of the red zone and out of the blue zone in order to be able to talk or think or make choices about their behavior, right? Nothing else will work until that happens. And all too often we do it opposite. We try to get them to think or talk or problem solve or something or whatever, think about their consequences when their alarm system is going off, and it's not possible. So when we talk about trauma responsive care is making sure that someone feels safe and in control. Now, safe just means the amygdala isn't freaking out. It's the environment feels safe, not is safe. Your individuals almost always are actually safe. That doesn't matter. My professor was safe in that movie theater. Nothing was going to happen to him. It did not matter. His amygdala saw, heard something, whatever, set off that alarm system. Okay. So they have to feel safe, whether that means you come closer and give them a hug, or back off and give them more space, or, make the loud music stop, or whatever it is. Their amygdala needs to start answering the question, am I safe, with yes. The amygdala is always asking that question every minute of every day. Am I safe? When the answer is no, it sets off that alarm system. We've got to get that alarm system shut off. Now, obviously, if there is an actual danger, you have to deal with the danger. But I'm assuming that what we're dealing with is there's no actual danger. This person is just, for reasons we may or may not know, triggered, right? Then we want them to be in control. And in control doesn't mean I am the boss of everyone. In control means the brains, the three brains in one, if you will, are all back online together and talking to each other. So now they can say, oh, that's not a snake, that's a stick. I don't have to run screaming out of the room. Oh, Kevin wasn't trying to hurt me when he bumped into me. I don't have to punch him in the face. I can make choices. I can think about the outcome of my behavior. To whatever level I'm usually able to do that, now I can go back to that, right? Whatever that is for me. So safe and in control. But there's a piece in the middle. And you'll notice that that piece was connected. Now, there are a lot of trauma models out there that in some way or another talk about safe and in control. SAMHSA, the sanctuary model, all of that stuff. In trauma responsive care, we added the word connected because we based it on brain science. So we'll talk about this and then we'll go to our lunch break. When I talk about the amygdala as kind of being the on switch, it sets off the chain reaction in the brain and then in the body to release the adrenaline, and we go into fight or flight, freeze, fawn, or we go down into collapse and dissociate, whatever that is. You can think of that amygdala as like the on switch. In the brain, everything we do, the 11 billion jillion things that we will do with our brain in our whole lifetimes, everything has a way to turn the nerve cells on and off, to turn the reaction or the network or the pathway or whatever language you're familiar with, to turn something on and to turn it off, which makes sense. Otherwise, I would start scratching my nose and I would never stop until my nose fell off. And in fact, if you have any folks that you work with that have some neurological disorders like Parkinson's, people with Parkinson's have trouble starting a movement with their body, and they also have trouble stopping it once it's started. So that's an example of the on-off switch of the brain. The on switch for fear chemically Remember I mentioned norepinephrine and cortisol. Your brain starts pumping out norepinephrine and cortisol. That's the on switch for these reactions. The off switch is dopamine and serotonin. You've heard of those. They are involved with many, many things, but they are, in this sense, both closely connected with closeness, safety, pleasure, warmth, comfort. They are the relational chemicals. There are some other ones too, oxytocin, vasopressin. We don't need to worry about that. So we're just going to talk about dopamine and serotonin. When your brain starts releasing dopamine and serotonin, it actually breaks down norepinephrine and cortisol. It breaks those chemicals down. It gets rid of them like putting soap in an oily pan. It breaks it up. So we could say that the off switch for fear, dopamine and serotonin. How do we release dopamine and serotonin? A lot of us spend a lot of time trying to release dopamine and serotonin over the past couple of years, right? So think about shutdown when we were all freaked out and stressed out. What did we all do a lot of? Cuddling on the couch, wearing our comfy jammies, eating comfort food. I don't know anybody who ate a lot of kale salad in those first few days. I know a lot of people who ate a lot of mac and cheese, including this girl. Watching comfort TV, right? All of that stuff. Basically anything we like, sex, drugs, gambling, shopping, all of those things will give our brain a little hit of dopamine and serotonin. But one of the most powerful, fastest ways to get our brain flooded with dopamine and serotonin is safe, loving connection with another human being who cares. That's it. That is one of the most direct, powerful ways to do that. And when that happens and the brain starts releasing dopamine and serotonin, it starts breaking down the norepinephrine and the cortisol. So that might be the person you've just met in the emergency room who's talking kindly to you. That might be your partner or your best friend of 40 years. It doesn't matter. But you guys already know what I'm telling you. You just didn't know the science behind it. There are people in your individual's lives. It might be you, it might be a family member, whomever, where the minute that person walks in the room, your individual starts to relax a little bit. So when you, let's say you're that person, when you do whatever they tolerate, everybody's a little different, but let's say you can let them hear your voice, they can see your face, you can tell them, hey, Lara, it's okay, you're safe, I'm here, it's gonna be okay. Their brain starts releasing dopamine and serotonin. Another word for all of that is just love. When we treat people in a loving way, when they have a safe, loving connection with us, then love is stronger than fear. So when we come back from our break, we're about to go on our break. When we come back, we will talk about a little bit more about what is going on with an individual when they are in these two states, how we begin to understand that a little more, and how we position ourselves. That will be the last part of our time together today, to be in a place ourselves where we feel safe, connected, and in control enough to offer that safety and connection to the individual we're working with. So we're going to pause here. I'm going to pause the slides. There we go. And let's see. Oh, okay. It is 11:31. So we will come back at 11:41. We're going to take, no, 51. Sorry. We're going to take 20 minutes. That's why I wasn't a math major. We'll have 20 minutes for our lunch break. And of course you can, you know, if you need to kind of finish up or sort of snack as we keep going, that's fine with me. And we will pick it up from here. Please put any comments or questions into the chat section, and I will make sure we start with that when we come back in 20 minutes. So have a good lunch, and I'll see you guys in a little bit.